It has been 10 years since Pat Conroy was elected as the MP for this electorate, and it is the right of every member to share facts on their elected representative, irrespective of whether they voted for them or not. Despite an election that saw Labor gain a majority and political power, Conroy suffered a modest swing against him, more than Labor's national swing. Why was that? Perhaps I can provide some answers. Naturally, some of what I say will be confronting to members, as it will challenge the orthodoxy, but as George Orwell said, if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. No doubt Pat has made all sorts of grandiose, self-inflating claims to the branches, either personally or through his proxies. However, an examination of his performance demonstrates more modest results. This lack of substance, which is evident in many in Labor and the Parliament more broadly, is undoubtedly why Conroy has such a massive sign outside his electorate office. In my opinion, this screams insecurity and of someone compensating for the fact that he knows he is only where he is because of cronyism, which ICAC considers a form of corruption, but it really has become the norm, and Australia, and indeed the entire West, is suffering for it. If you don't believe me, perhaps you would believe Sonia Hornery, who at the time of the pre-selection in 2013 told me Conroy was just a hack. He has no professional experience and has never worked a day in his life in a real job, a point which John Mills also stated during the pre-selection, as the reason he could not vote for him. Pat, and as I understand his mother, both worked for Albanese. Retired and decorated U.S. Army Colonel Douglas McGregor, who was a former senior advisor to a U.S. president, whose truthful and sobering assessments about the causes and situation in Ukraine explains the phenomena most succinctly. The way you get to the top is by questioning nothing and swearing unconditional obedience to dumb ideas. And when you have these conditions, you inevitably get people that reach the top on the basis of political connections, good friends in the right places, and having not really offended or ruffled any feather. So I'd like to provide some concrete examples of why Conroy has been worse than ineffectual, and why the trajectory of Labor's primary vote has also been stuck in the 30s percentage-wise. I checked the Parliament's Hansard for entries relating to Conroy, and in the course of 18 months, only found a pitiful 34. Most were of little substance. One of them was Conroy honouring a genuine man of Labour, Bob Brown, after his passing, despite admitting he never met him. Most egregiously and hypocritically was Conroy's agreement with Bob's position on the Vietnam War, and if one knew anything about Bob, you knew that he did not trust the United States. What makes Conroy such a hypocrite is that, not because of his tacit consent of Australia's support of Ukraine in a conflict the US engineered, but within months of entering Parliament he said in Parliament he supported the United States with every fibre of his being. Such a strong statement clearly endorses US actions, disasters and crimes such as developing genetically targeted bioweapons in contravention of biological warfare conventions. This is pure evil. If Conroy knew Bob, or did his research better, he would know Bob was one of a handful of politicians in Parliament when Labor took power in the first Hawke government, to push for an open and transparent inquiry into the role of the United States in Gough Whitlam's dismissal. A dismissal which Christopher Boyce, a U.S. intelligence contractor, admitted was orchestrated by the United States, and was the reason for him to start supplying information to the Soviet Union. So enraged he was that the United States would so severely interfere in such a close ally. It is anathema to Labor to be such sycophants of the United States given their actions against the Labor legend, Gough Whitlam. The United States are capitalists, imperialists, colonialists, and one of the most vehemently anti-union nations on the planet, yet Conroy and Labor are driving us closer and closer. Conroy is only living up to his idol's legacy. That idol is Bob Hawke. British journalist Kit Clarenberg, among others, reported a shocking piece on Hawke, sourced from information released by the U.S. Archives, how a new study of declassified diplomatic cables that claims Bob Hawke acted as an informer to the U.S. government while boss of the Australian trade union movement and president of the ALP. With a photo of Hawke in his office, such treachery is what it appears Conroy aspires to, and his statement, that he supports the US with every fiber of his being is, in my view, him offering himself up to be the next willing and compliant tool for the US, in exchange for wealth and power. The releases from the archive show that Hawke met with the largest of the corporate captains and investment heads in the US, who wanted Australia to privatize and to change in the image of the US. Hawke delivered, in doing so betraying Australian workers, unionists and Labor members. He gave advance warning and insider information on planned strikes and industrial action by workers at major US corporations operating in Australia. For this loyalty, he was invited to Washington to meet representatives of Chase Manhattan Bank, the International Chamber of Commerce, Brookings Institution, and other organizations, and be educated in the merits of the then burgeoning doctrine of neoliberalism. Conroy was off to a bad start, however, as cables released by WikiLeaks show that the US Embassy in Australia was aware of Greg Cumbey's advisor, and was shocked that he had no military or defense experience yet was advising the Minister for Defense Material. How crazy it is then that this utterly unqualified person is now the minister. Colonel McGregor's theory is looking sound. But more than this, let's look at 4 policy positions that Conroy has been totally wrong on. Firstly, the acquisition by Australia of the F-35. I first brought a motion to this branch about this in 2008 or 2009. I met with Conroy himself about this issue at Cumbey's invitation. It was obvious he did not know what he was talking about. Although she did not tell me why, Marg Jasan Clark contacted me after this meeting to ask me where I was getting my information from. This was clearly on behalf of Conroy, as Marg expressed little interest in this issue. Marg also demonstrated the double standard that exists within Labor, as I recall that in 2011, when I was building my home, Marg derisively asked if I was building a McMansion. The envy of anyone having anything nice was palpable. However, for Pat, who, as I mentioned, was not a worker who risked his life for years in Sydney like I did, but was simply anointed, him living in waterside properties was fine for members. Back to the F-35, however, despite the issues I raised, echoed by many others, Labor committed Australia to buy these aircraft. By 2019, there was 996 problems with the F-35, in 2021 857 problems, of which 7 are critical. At best, half of them are available at any one time, and they have been grounded numerous times. The stealth coding that Conroy boasted about when I met with him is a major problem. The US Air Force, which flies the same version Australia does, has already stated the program is a failure and is looking to develop a new aircraft. My option would have saved Australia at least $15 billion and provided the country with a system that works. Next, there is the issue of climate change and the carbon pricing policy. It was humorous to read in Hansard of Conroy's attack on the Greens about their position on carbon pricing policy. While the Greens have been duplicitous, it was Labor who introduced an emissions trading scheme, which James Hansen, the former NASA climate scientist, which first put this issue on the map, prior to the Copenhagen Climate Summit in 2010, rejected emissions trading schemes, and a former senior economist who prepared the costings for Australia to adopt the Kyoto Protocol, Brett Evil, concurred that emissions trading schemes are an illusion of a solution. I passed a motion prior to the summit for Labor not to support emissions trading policies, because of Hansen's position, and the fact that one of the biggest lobby groups for emissions trading was comprised of the biggest polluters. Like every single motion put forward at this branch, this was ignored. Of course, this was never really Conroy's policy that he advised the minister to adopt, but the one skill of the serial exaggerator is to present the work of others as their own. Emissions trading is what business wanted when Hansen, Evil and others said the only way to reduce emissions was with a carbon tax, which Gillard promised not to introduce. I would like to point out on this issue that the push to abandon oil is not simply due to environmental concerns, but economic and geopolitical. It is forecast that in 8 years' time the US will again return to being an importer of oil. Losing energy independence will make the US very vulnerable, especially now that the world's largest oil producers are members of the BRICS Plus economic alliance, which excludes Western nations, and our economic and geopolitical competitors. The cost of energy is one of the greatest factors that drive economic growth and prosperity. The third policy issue I raised at the last branch meeting I attended in 2014, that of the Data Retention Bill 2014 and the National Security Amendment Bill No. 1, 2014, which was followed by several more authoritarian and dystopian legislation under the coalition, which had largely bipartisan support. At that branch meeting, Conroy gave a long and impassioned defense as to why he supported this legislation, ultimately relying on the weakest argument of names dropping and following what someone else told him to do, when he said he spoke to John Faulkner about it, hoping that might win branch members over or make it acceptable. Conroy refused to even consider the need for a review of the legislation. I am sure Conroy did not even know the practical impact of this legislation, with authorities being able to violate people's rights and apply for a warrant afterwards. Julian Burnside, a Queen's Counsel and human rights advocate, said that the metadata laws are edging Australia one short step closer to being a sort of secret police state. Within 6 months I was proven right, and Conroy very wrong, as it was revealed that the legislation was being abused by the AFB and almost certainly ASIO, and had to be amended. Bill Shorten subsequently requested that the government refer the laws to the Independent National Security Legislation Monitor for review. On this issue alone it demonstrates Conroy is out of his depth and has no place governing this country. This legislation opened the gate for others, and when the coalition introduced further legislation, Australia's Human Rights Commission president at the time, Gillian Triggs, led the chorus of criticism, accusing the government and opposition Labor Party of colluding to increase government powers under the veil of national security by passing laws which violate fundamental freedoms. Freedom of speech is being eradicated in the West. Germany, Ireland, and the UK have all introduced or are introducing laws to curb free speech. US government agencies have been working with big tech to silence people, and they nearly introduced a disinformation board, aka Ministry of Truth, despite having freedom of speech enshrined in their Bill of Rights. The UK has the Orwellian-named Trusted News Initiative, which is cooperation between legacy media and big tech to censor and control information. Alina Lipp is a German journalist who has been prosecuted for reporting from the Donbass. Another man was convicted for a satirical book cover regarding COVID policy and faces jail. At the start of the conflict in Ukraine, the first act of liberal democracies was to ban Russian media. While our society bears some similarities with the society George Orwell described in 1984, I believe our society more closely resembles that which Aldous Huxley described in Brave New World. He wrote, "The perfect dictatorship would have the appearance of a democracy, but would basically be a prison without walls in which the prisoners would not even dream of escaping. It would essentially be a system of slavery where, through consumption and entertainment, the slaves would love their servitude." Conroy's conscious support gave birth to that which Robert F. Kennedy Jr. feared when he said, "When we turn America into an imperium abroad, we are going to turn America into a national security state at home. The two are conjoined. You can't have an imperial nation abroad and continue to have a democracy at home. You are going to turn it into a garrison state, a security state, a surveillance state, and that is what we have got today." The final policy issue was also raised by Conroy at the last branch meeting I attended, and that was on the air warfare destroyers and Canberra-class amphibious vessels, the Canberra-class being vessels that I opposed acquiring at this branch years before. Conroy claimed that he had done a lot of work on this acquisition while working for Combay. As some may remember, I worked for the Department of Defense from 2012. I left in 2019. Between 2016 and 2019 I worked for the Navy's Engineering Division, and actually led its reformation in 2016. I worked with the Navy engineers responsible for maintaining the fleet and fixing problems, and I can tell you that, even though Conroy exaggerated his role in their acquisition, which I won't go into now, the air warfare destroyers were a nightmare, and among many problems, they could not operate at sea for more than a few days before having to return to port. Now if you look at Conroy's performance as a minister, you will also only be disappointed. Not simply because of the policies that I have covered, but as an advisor to Conroy was disappointing. McKinsey is a major U.S. consulting corporation, and in 2010, they did an audit and review of military spending efficiency, in which Australia and the United States came equal last. There was no improvement under Conroy and Conroy. Conroy has only supported disastrous decisions regarding defense spending and strategy such as AUKUS and the acquisition of nuclear submarines at an average cost of over $41 billion per submarine. Paul Keating was correct to condemn this, and he is joined by numerous ALP branches in electorates of Tanya Plibersek and Anthony Albanese, who have passed motions against the AUKUS deal. Professor Jeffrey Sachs said, "We've gotten the Australians to spend a fortune they cannot afford by the way, and does nothing for their security to start buying submarines as part of a new AUKUS alliance, which makes no sense whatsoever." In the past few months, there has been agitation among left-wing branches on both the strategic impact of AUKUS and the potential for it to drain money from traditional Labor priorities such as health, education and welfare. In July, a Sydney Federal Electoral Council, FEC, passed a motion declaring that AUKUS is not in the interests of the Australian people, threatens a regional arms race, and could take Australia into an unnecessary and devastating war. With regard to strategy, the last defence white paper of an ALP government, in 2010, said that Australia needed to be more self-reliant and buy more off-the-shelf equipment, only to do the complete opposite, and within a short time, when Obama visited, agreed to allow a permanent presence of US Marines in Australia. Since then, Australia has agreed to build facilities for the US Navy and has allowed rotation of B-52 nuclear-capable bombers to Australia. Australian manufacturing is as rare as a Tasmanian tiger, but Conroy wants to build missiles here. Conroy is Minister for International Development and the Pacific, and in the 2023 Defence Strategic Review it states, Australia's focus must be to deepen its engagement and collaboration with partners across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, yet many countries have openly criticised Australia's actions regarding the basing of nuclear-powered and nuclear-capable platforms on our territory. The 2023 Defence Strategic Review which is a Labor product, and Conroy has supported everything that Albanese, Wong, and Miles have proclaimed, including Australia's subservience to the rules-based global order, as stated in the Strategic Review. What is the rules-based international order? Where are these rules written, and when did we sign up to them? No politician will be able to tell you what they are because, as Professor John Duggard, a South African, a member of the UN's International Law Commission said, the rules-based international order is a con job and has no legitimacy under international law. The rules-based order is simply whatever the United States wants at that time, and it is not even an international order because, for example, the nations which represent 80% of the world's population have not joined the sanctions against Russia. Incredibly, the 2023 Defence Strategic Review does not mention Russia once in 116 pages, despite the fact that the Albanese government has not just continued, but expanded Australia's involvement in the conflict in Ukraine, including deploying aircraft to Germany to operate over Poland, Romania and possibly the Black Sea to gather and provide intelligence, making Australia a direct participant in the conflict with all the potential consequences that entails, which has not been made clear to the Australian public. Conroy and the rest of the Albanese government have committed Australia to deeper cooperation with the US, allowing more US bases in Australia, and outrageously signing contracts directly with the Pentagon, allowing them access to our resources to feed the US war machine. And speaking of Ukraine, why has Conroy and the rest of Labor all fallen into line supporting a nation controlled by Nazi groups, and which is hostile to workers? Zelensky's government has imposed some of the world's most aggressive anti-worker policies, passing legislation that deprives around 73% of workers of their right to union protection and collective bargaining, which even the US government-funded Solidarity Center of the AFL-CIO Labor Federation condemned as a significant assault on worker rights in Ukraine. If you also don't believe that neo-Nazis are a significant and controlling presence, let me show you how. Before the 24th of February, 2022 there was plenty of coverage by Western media, who for months proclaimed there was no Nazis in Ukraine, but have now changed their tune to admitting there are some, but they are minority. Albanese, Wong, and numerous other ALP politicians have all claimed that Russia's operation is both illegal and unprovoked. This is as factual as the claims that Ukraine is winning or Ukraine's official death toll is still 10,000. Numerous internationally renowned academics, such as Professor John Mearsheimer, and leftist academics Jeffrey Sachs and Norm Finkelstein, have all said the conflict in Ukraine is the most provoked conflict in history, and Russia's recognition of the Donetsk and Luhansk republics as independent is an important point in the legality of its actions under Section 51 of the UN Charter. Certainly more legality than the most of the United States' 201 military interventions since 2001 alone. Even Pope Francis said the conflict was provoked by NATO. If anyone wants to argue that Ukraine is anything other than a US project and a proxy war, you would be arguing against numerous politicians who have admitted this themselves, and against Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who admitted America's foreign policy establishment manipulated Ukraine into war. Now rather than acknowledge failure, Biden administration prepares to sacrifice American lives too. Polish President Andrzej Duda explained this year that it was cheaper to fight Russia with Ukrainian lives. U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham said, and I paraphrase, "Killing Russians is the best money the U.S. has ever spent." Republican Mitt Romney said similarly, for a fraction of the U.S. defense budget, and without losing American lives, the U.S. was hurting Russia. These people are sociopaths. And disgustingly Australian media is only too happy to parrot this propaganda, such as the Fin Review. But virtually all Western media are involved in spreading propaganda, when just a few years ago they reported truth. There are a few points that must be made about Ukraine, because it will impact Australia and Labor's future. Former US military and intelligence officers have been telling the truth about this conflict, and it is contrary to what our government and the media are saying. The origins of this conflict can be accurately drawn back to the early 1990s. However, the stage was set in 2008, when the US declared Ukraine would become a member of NATO, violating the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, in which Ukraine agreed to be politically independent. One of the chief architects of the current disaster, now Deputy Secretary of State Victoria Nuland, admitted that the US spent $5 billion to bring democracy to Ukraine, and was heavily involved in the Maidan coup of 2014, with her phone calls being famously intercepted by Russian intelligence, and leaked, in which she and the US ambassador to Ukraine discussed who they would install in a new Ukrainian government. Despite her admission about the billions caught on video, online you will mostly find Western fact-checkers saying this is false. Recently Nuland admitted the US had been planning the recent and disastrous Ukrainian counteroffensive for 5 months. The new Ukrainian government's first piece of legislation was to move to ban the Russian language in Ukraine, which most people spoke, which is in violation of the UN Convention on Human Rights. By April 2014, when Russian-speaking regions protested, President Poroshenko launched the anti-terrorism operation and started a civil war in Ukraine. At this time Zelensky himself appealed for Russian-speaking Ukrainians, of which he was one, to be left alone.
И в Крыму люди хотят говорить по-русски, отцепитесь, отстаньте от них. На законном основании дайте им возможность говорить по-русски. Язык никогда не будет делить нашу родную страну. У меня еврейская кровь, я говорю по-русски, но я гражданин Украины. Я люблю эту страну и не хочу быть частью другой страны. Россия и Украина, мы действительно братские народы. Я знаю миллионы, я знаю тысячи людей, которые живут в России, замечательные люди, мы одного цвета, у нас одинаковая кровь, мы все друг друга понимаем, независимо от языка.
Over the next few years Russia supported the Minsk I and II peace agreements, which were never ratified by Ukraine, we now know, by US pressure. President Poroshenko, then French President François Hollande and German Chancellor Merkel, who were signatories, later confessed in interviews that the peace agreements were a ruse to buy more time for Ukraine to prepare for war with Russia. This has been the West's plan for literally decades. In late September 2023, the head of NATO admitted they deliberately provoked Russia knowing the consequences. Over 4,000 Ukrainian civilians died from 2014 until the time Russian forces entered Ukraine, the final trigger being in the week prior to the 24th of February, 2022, when the Ukrainian army broke the ceasefire with the largest barrage of artillery in years, which UN observers saw and reported. Note the date of the Reuters story. Western media, however, was silent. With 120,000 soldiers poised to strike the Donbass, merely 30 kilometers away, the Russians moved in with the stated goals of denazifying and demilitarizing Ukraine. The Ukrainians and Russians signed a draft peace agreement in Turkey in early April 2022 in which Ukraine would remain neutral. However, even Robert F. Kennedy Jr. admits, the U.S. dispatched Boris Johnson to Kiev to instruct Ukraine to abandon peace talks and the West would assist Ukraine. Former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett confirmed this. The fight to the last Ukrainian began. And yes, there are Nazis in Ukraine, lots and lots of Nazis, which the left-wing Albanese Labor government has supported with bushmasters, artillery, drones and with direct military assistance. Labor can only be condemned for this immoral, insane act. Australia supports people such as these.
Ведь детям еще в детском садике объяснили, почему плохо быть Машей или Петей.
Мариночка, ти будеш різати русню?
Да.
Що ти будеш робити?
Русню резать! Я буду резать Чечню!
Очевидно, что семья маргинальная, но политика, которую проводят современные украинские власти, приводит к тому, что подобные частные случаи становятся реальной силой, которая...
Я буду резать русню! Я буду резать русню! Смерть русне! Слава Украине! Секай!
Only very recently Canada was condemned by the UN for honoring an SS veteran from Ukraine in Canadian Parliament in the presence of Zelensky. One Canadian media deceptively described this Nazi as someone who fought for Ukrainian independence from Russia during World War II. Incorporating Ukraine into NATO is a direct threat to the Russian Federation, as you can see with this graphic from a British newspaper. NATO has missiles in Poland and Romania at present and are boasting how hypersonic missiles they don't actually have yet will be able to reach Moscow within minutes from Germany, once they are deployed. If located in Ukraine, such missiles would have a flight time of 3 minutes to Moscow. Any nations would rightly consider this intolerable, and it is grossly hypocritical when Australia complains about China signing agreements with the Solomon Islands, who are 2,000 kilometers from us. Just to give you a few facts about Ukraine, where billions of our dollars are going. It has been credibly reported that Ukrainian officials are involved in human and child trafficking and black market organ trading from the bodies of their soldiers. Ukraine is in the top 3 nations producing child porn. Ukraine is now starting to conscript women, with a video recently released of a demonstration of body armor for pregnant women. Ukraine has also relaxed rules for conscription of men with disabilities and mental illnesses. Ukraine is one of the most corrupt nations in the world, with numerous top officials having been fired for corruption, and even the CIA director allegedly chastising Zelensky himself for taking too much of the aid money. Zelensky has suspended elections, previously arrested the main opposition leader, closed numerous TV stations and newspapers critical of him, all while he and the West claim Ukraine is fighting for democracy and freedom. Petro Poroshenko introduced legislation to make it a criminal offense to even sing the Internationale, the anthem of the international left. Ukraine has been venerating Nazis for years, elevating Nazi collaborator Stepan Bandera to national hero and his group, a recognized terrorist organization. The inspiration for contemporary nationalist groups in Ukraine, such as the aptly named Right Sector, and the Azov Battalion, which uses well-known white supremacist and Nazi imagery in its logo. Outrageously, however, even Australian universities have sought to deny Nazism among Azov and Ukraine in general. Just like the real Nazis, these groups ran summer camps for children, which were really indoctrination centers. Would you like your children or grandchildren to attend such a camp? Western media ran numerous stories about Ukraine's Nazi problem before February 2022, but after just denials. Too cowardly to fight Russia themselves, NATO has subcontracted out this war, which has, with a Ukrainian veterans charity admitting Ukraine's killed in action figure is over 400,000. Total casualties are a multiple of that. Plans have been revealed for one of the largest military cemeteries in the world to be built outside of Kiev, able to hold 600,000 graves. Pat Conroy has been as silent on all of this as he has been on Julian Assange, who should be freed before Australia considered even signing up to AUKUS. In 2016, while still with Defence, I wrote to Julian offering a plan to help him get to a safe country. Conroy was not one of the 48 MPs who signed a letter supporting Assange in April, and he did not sign this most recent letter. This electorate is just a vehicle for his ambition, just like Combay, who promised to return to visit our electorate, but never has. Conroy boasted of $29 million for GP services out of what is a federal budget of over $600 billion. The amount Conroy has secured equates to 0.00005%. What a hero of the working class. Here are some pictures of Pat hard at work while I recount a short story about the one thing Conroy is good at, getting his picture taken. Pat organized to attend a business in the southern end of the electorate. This business has dozens of employees. I spoke with an employee who was present, and he said that the employees were looking forward to meet their federal MP and engage with him. They tied it up and even went and got coffee and morning tea. So you can imagine their surprise when Conroy arrived, didn't even enter the building, and was there for no more than 5 minutes to get a photo with the management and then left. In speaking with the employee, he said there was clearly no misunderstanding by the company, and Conroy lost a lot of votes that day. I would like to end by briefly explaining what I predict will happen to Australia and the ALP unless fundamental change is made. The West has led the world for centuries, and that is coming to an end. The conflict in Ukraine is as much an economic war as a military one. Australia, and those countries tied to the US dollar and financial system, will decline, and if we do not experience a depression, it will be a severe recession. The gap between rich and poor, which grew after 2 prior terms of Labor rule according to ACOS, will continue to widen, and it will be very interesting to see what happens to this gap under the present Labor government. It is Labor's lack of progress towards the goals stated in the party's constitution that barely a third of Australians vote Labor, and the branches are so weak. Labor is utterly tribal, which is the most primitive form of political unit, and if you want to see what real left-wing politicians look like, listen to Claire Daly and Mick Wallace from Ireland in the EU Parliament. I agree with Andrew Lee that this must change for the party to become more relevant and inviting to Australians and particularly workers who built this party, not factional hacks. Professor Jeffrey Sachs recently said, "The Anglo-Saxon parts of the world have gone mad." When asked to explain, he said, "I watch it in Australia, I watch it elsewhere, these politicians just squirm." This really is just the security state of the United States that spreads its umbrella over the other countries, they can barely move. It is incredible that Paul Keating, a right-winger, has to be the one to say Australia needs to be more independent, and that means moving away from the United States. The BRICS nations, which recently added 6 new members, will add yet more members next year. BRICS already accounts for the majority of the world's population, about half of the world's GDP, far greater than the G7, and the majority of the world's oil-producing nations, which means they control global energy. The US and its allies presently sanctioned 1/3 of the world's population, and the rest of the world is sick of it. Former UK Ambassador Craig Murray recently said that if the United States military confronts or seeks to contain China, Australia will be destroyed, just like Ukraine. With regard to making China an enemy, he said why Australia is going along with this is even more extraordinary. The US is determined to fight Russia until the death of the last Ukrainian, and I can see they would be happy to get into a limited conflict with China until the death of the last Australian. The U.S. Army War College recently said that the United States cannot fight Russia, and in a major war could expect to take 3,600 casualties a day, which would require conscription, and that would be politically impossible. Naturally, even if there is just a new Cold War, China will look to abandon its trade where possible with Australia, resulting in a severe drop in Australia's GDP. Australia, which has become morally and intellectually bankrupt, risks becoming financially bankrupt as well. Australia is a commodities economy, and our budget surplus is because of the BRICS Plus countries, who are our natural economic partners. Australia should not support hypocrisy. Autocracy will increase, as we have seen with COVID policy and the previous dystopian legislation I mentioned, and we will end up as a banana republic in a minor bloc at the economic mercy of other nations. With such a national decline, so too will the ALP.